Now on Radio 4, our book at bedtime, work by another author on this year's Granta list of the 20 best young British novelists. Adam Foulds is the author of 2 novels, including The Quickening Maze, about the poet John Clare. It was shortlisted for the Booker and Walter Scott Prizes. This extract from his forthcoming novel is called A World Intact and is read by Harry Lloyd.
And here was a world intact, like a dream of his childhood. After years of war, not a sign, except the sight from the train of numerous young land girls silently labouring. In London there were shelters, sandbags and gun emplacements. Here, nothing. Trees washed through with birdsong, the smell of the ground breathing upwards through the thick, moist heat. As Will started out, his feet remembered the exact rise and fall of the walk home from the station. How perfectly his senses interlocked with the place. He knew the pepperish smell of the river before he could see it. Behind his left shoulder was the rippled shape of an Iron Age hill fort where he'd played as a child. Everything here was still clean and fresh and in place. Will decided to avoid the village and headed down through the wood. "And where do you think you're going?" Startled, Will turned to see his younger brother, Ed, his open shotgun hooked over his shoulder. "Oh, for God's sake, Ed!" Ed smiled. They shook hands. "You didn't hear me, did you?" "Can't say that I did." "Makes a fellow wonder who's been in training and who hasn't." Ed was much given to stealth. He loved hunting and had a straightforward aptitude for it that Will sometimes envied. Father had been similar, a quiet grammarian indoors, but a sportsman outside, hard-riding, red-faced, breathing great volumes of air. A mere schoolmaster, he'd been invited to join the hunt after the last war, when he'd returned with a medal. With the medal. It was outdoors that Will was allowed glimpses of his father's mysterious heroism. "Why aren't you fishing?" Will asked. "I can't imagine there's anything left to shoot." "Ah, but for them what knows the old woods like I does." Ed reached into the front pocket of his waistcoat and carefully lifted out a bird. "There's this." "Oh, you little tinker. A woodcock, when everyone else is working on the nth permutation of bully beef." Will took the bird from his brother. Its head hung over his fingers on the loose cord of its neck. The small body was warm. Will's senses were lighting up. Home again after weeks of training grounds, weapons drills and dismal food. "That's a very generous homecoming gift," Will said. "It isn't any such thing," Ed said, and took the bird back. "I'll give it to Mother. You'll probably eat it tonight in a pie." They walked out of the wood, the shadowy trees gently breaking apart to reveal the river. "You pleased to be home?" "I won't be back for long." Immediately he was inside the house, Will felt himself claimed by the familiar aroma of the place. It was a combination of many things: carpets, dogs, wood, the garden, the damp in the cellar. But too subtle to be separated. It was more a mood, a life. It contained his school holidays, his father's presence, his father's death. A world intact. "Oh, Mother, where art thou?" He found her in the kitchen, leaning over the newspaper. "Surprise?" "Oh, crikey, here he is. William of Arabia?" she said, fixing her spectacles on top of her head before reaching her arms towards him. That annoyed him, the quick flash accusation of emulation, as though T. Lawrence were the only man in the world to learn Arabic, to be a soldier. She pulled him forwards and kissed him vividly on the temple. "So you've survived training?" "Well, outwardly I seem fine, don't I?" "Near enough. Some chaps broke limbs with the motorcycle training." "Broken limbs on motorcycles?" "Off motorcycles. Up a hill as fast as you can, whiz round, then down again likewise. They disconnected the brakes to make it more difficult. Intelligence, Mother. It's not your usual soldiering." "No, it doesn't sound like it." The predicted pie appeared for supper. The fine dark meat of the woodcock, with its flavours of dusk and decaying leaves, impaired by a horrible margarine pastry. His mother said, "You know, I had hoped the war would have finished before you got dragged into it. But you wouldn't want a fellow to miss his chance." "I think I could cope." "Well, it's my duty, isn't it? It's what father would have wanted." "I'm not so sure you know that." "Why wouldn't he?" "You're his son." "I know that. It's all somewhat academic anyway. I've been posted." It wasn't what he'd wanted. It was not what he deserved, with his Arabic and ambition. He'd been warned by one NCO during training. "You need blue eyes to get a commission. Take my word for it, you'll end up in a dustbin with the rest of them." There was a look for the officer class, and Will didn't have it. 5 feet 9 inches tall, he had dark hair and dark eyes and a low centre of gravity. And this was unfair. In his soul he was tall, a keen, wind-honed figure. The man who decided Will's future considered the paperwork through small spectacles. Finally he looked up. "All very commendable. I'm putting you in for the field security services." The dustbin. Will pinched the bridge of his nose. "If I may, sir, I was hoping for the Special Operations Executive." "The duty to which we are assigned," the man interrupted, "is where we must do our duty." And so Will had humiliated himself, precisely in the way he told himself he never would. "Sir?" "What?" "I'm not sure I should mention this, but my father distinguished himself in the last war." "Yes?" "He was awarded the VC." "Jolly good. You should try to be like him." The commanding officer of the unit Will was assigned to was tall. A wistful blonde, younger than Will by a couple of years. An Oxford rowing blue, unobjectionable and unprepared. To Will he said, "And suddenly we're soldiers. It's all a bit unreal, isn't it?" But they weren't soldiers. Not really. The only danger Will could perceive was spending the remainder of the war guarding an English airbase, doing nothing at all. Will considered how much of this to tell his mother. "We needn't look so worried. I'm not going far just yet. Port protection sort of thing. Security." "Well, isn't that police work?" Will felt an urge to throw his drink in his mother's face. "Well, it's what I've been assigned to do until I am posted abroad." After supper, they listened to the wireless, angling their heads towards its glow. Mother was sewing, her needle rising and sinking. The wireless made Will crave action and involvement with a feeling akin to hunger. He was very alert. He'd had years of this now. Battle reports, a piecemeal geography of the war, its victories and defeats. You couldn't really know what was going on, but Will, with his deep reading and cynicism, made shrewd guesses. The reports were vibrant with what was never said about the battles, the terror and exaltation. The war was large and endlessly turbulent. There was room in it for someone like Will, for his kind of independent mastery. He wanted in. When the news reports gave way to dance band music, Will got up to go into his father's study. The room had its own stillness. The book spines, the vertical pleats of the heavy blue curtains. Behind Will, the sofa on which his father had died. Somewhere in a drawer was the medal his father never took out. The room's composed silence was like the silence of Will's father himself. He had always coughed quietly before he spoke. Sometimes Will felt as though the empty study might do the same. Clear its throat delicately and say something short and neat. Something devastating. A terrifying rupture of his reserve had presaged Will's father's death. He'd come back from the hunt after being unhorsed. He'd landed badly and sat down to dinner looking pale with a deep red scratch trenching his cheek. Ed asked what had happened. "What do you bloody well think happened?" "Darling, what are you leaping into the breach for? damn fool question, and I have a pounding headache." He'd leaned over and vomited onto the carpet right there at his feet. They all sat there, waiting through the noise, the wrenching up out of his body. Father sat up straight and gulped water. "Don't just all gawk at me like that. I'm obviously ill. I'm going to lie down." He stood up, swayed, and stalked out to his study. Half an hour later, Will's mother found him dead on the study sofa. Dead and gone, having hardly ever said anything at all to his sons. Will read along a shelf. Something fine and enhancing of his intellect. Lucretius, on the nature of the universe? Reading Latin would keep his mind active. Will would have this and his Arabic poetry. Inside he saw his father's pasted Ex Libris, signed with his fastidious pen strokes. Henry Walker, 1921. He began reading it that night in his boyhood bedroom. In the morning he drew the curtains, a neutral light, white and even. There was none of the gorgeous lustre of the previous day, and this was almost a relief. The world was a realer place, more practical. Then he noticed in the glass of one pane of the window the twist of bubbles. They had been a small magic of his childhood, catching the light differently, sparkling a little. As a child he'd almost felt them inside himself, a sensation of excitement spiralling up in his breast, and they connected his room to the river, as though his windows were formed from panels of the river's surface. The bubbles in the window filled him, even before he'd gone, with a grand feeling of nostalgia for this house and the landscape and his childhood. But gradually he became aware of a dark outline around that emotion, a constriction, and realized that it was fear. At breakfast, Will told his mother that he was off that day to his posting, and she fell silent. They chewed through their rough and watery meal of national loaf and powdered eggs, and after that she disappeared. Will was used to interpreting her silences. A stiff, stoical farewell was all that was required, but instead she would force him to think of her, in this pristine place in the middle of England. She would be here, imagining him blown to bits. This thought demanded that he imagine his death also. Typical. Her determination never to make a scene often resulted in cramped, unresolved situations like this. Useless woman. A boy going away to war without a goodbye from his mother. Ed walked with Will towards the station. They parted with a firm handshake. Will thought that Ed may have held on to his hand a fraction longer than necessary and said, "Well, let's not be silly about this. I'll be back before you know it. There'll probably be some administrative foul-up resulting in delays." Ed put his hands in his pockets. "Well, it's all delays for me." Will smiled. "It's nice for Mother, though." Ed hitched an eyebrow, then turned to go. Will watched him vanishing and appearing through the trees. Ed was heading home, sinking back into his place. Then Will turned himself and headed towards the station, out into the world and the war, and he was glad to be going.
Harry Lloyd was reading A World Intact by Adam Foulds, selected from Granta's Best Young British Novelists. The abridger was Julian Wilkinson and the producer, Di Speirs.
A, E, I...
Take your time. No hurry, relaxed breathing.
Even monarchs are mortal.
The King must broadcast live.
Damn him, I can't say crowned, can't say king.
Try to set your fears aside.
The endearing story of George VI and his speech therapist.
Duty must come first, before self.
A King's Speech, this Tuesday morning at 11:15 and again in the evening at 9:15, over on BBC Radio 4 Extra.
This is BBC Radio 4.